just to finish up the Abrahamic covenant, which really is an overview of Genesis, as you can see. We're familiar with a lot of the stories in Genesis, and they are there so that we can have a grasp of what God is doing. They stand alone in terms of teaching us many things about our relationship with God, about faith, about His personal relationship with us. But it is also there to carry forth what He has laid out as to how He will ultimately restore the earth to His original intent, and that is that man would glorify Him by reigning over the creation that He put there for us, and how that was untracked for a while in the garden. And so the Abrahamic covenant is that which really takes us forward. And we noted that God gives the promises in chapter 12. He delineates them a little further and gives them a little more, do I want to try this word this early in the morning? Specificity. Ooh, I got it out. I can't always get that word out, especially this time in the morning. I've been working on it for years. And then finally in chapter 15, in response to Abraham's concerns, his fears, his doubts, he's getting old. And God has made him this promise that has to do with land, it has to do with inheritance, it has to do with descendants. And Abraham just is not there yet, does not have descendants. And so God confirms to him by covenant. He entered into a unilateral covenant. He made certain promises to Abraham. He obligated himself alone to fulfill those. And that was the whole issue of Abraham having prepared the sacrifices, going to sleep over here, being revealed certain things in a dream about his many descendants who would be a nation, who would leave and come back over the next several hundred years. And then God passes through the pieces, signing the covenant for both of them. And so we see in no uncertain terms, it's unmistakable, that God is entering into a one-sided agreement with Abraham. He was obligating himself and himself alone to fulfill these promises. And of course, that's what we see with the birth of Isaac to Abraham and Sarah. God continues to work with their faith. He continues to develop in their relationship with Him, but also works miraculously so that He will bring about the blessing of all the families of the earth through Abraham and through Abraham's descendants. And so that really is the essence of what we find in terms of the overview of God's purposes. And the rest of Genesis is in many ways, is working out of that and is fulfilling that. Now, we have gone through your notes up to page what? 34? Right. So we do have Isaac being born. We have the death of Sarah at chapter 23 at 127 years old. And not everybody was living to this age, but God gave them this length of life. We see Isaac marrying Rebekah when he's 40. And remember, Abraham is careful to send his servant back to the home territory so that he would not marry someone who would drag his faith down, who would untrack this program that God had. And we're going to see that a number of times. In fact, moving the nation down to Egypt is that same thing. We find the birth of Jacob and Esau. And Isaac is 60 years old at this time in chapter 25, and finally the death of Abraham in chapter 25 and verse 8 at 175 years old. Abraham is called the friend of God. 3 times in the Bible he is referred to as the friend of God. He had a very close relationship with God, but also the importance of the Abrahamic covenant for the rest of the Old Testament and even for us today, because our blessing in Christ ultimately is founded in the covenant God made with Abraham. because it says in Galatians that he is the one special seed that came from Abraham, that one special descendant. And so Abraham's descendants will eventually come through Christ, and Christ will be then the key to this blessing, the final and ultimate key to the blessing. And so we see these events. We have the covenant confirmed to Isaac and to Jacob in chapters 26 and 28. And these are important. Again, it shows us that that God is carrying forth this promise. It says, he went up to Beersheba. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you. Multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. So he built an altar there, called on the name of the Lord. He pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. So Isaac has a relationship with God. God is blessing him because he had made this covenant with Abraham. And so he says, I will bless you, multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. And so we find this covenant being confirmed to Isaac, and then later on to Jacob in chapter 28. Says, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your descendants. So the exact same promise, you see. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south, and in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's the exact same thing that God said to Abraham in Genesis 12. And so we see that this is being carried forward to the two sons, the son and the grandson of Abraham. Behold, I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Now, you can put Israel in there as a nation, and the same thing is going to be said, not in exact same words, through the rest of the Old Testament. When God chooses an instrument and obligates himself to do something through that instrument, then it's going to be done. I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. And so we see again just this unilateral, one-sided, God-initiated, God's responsible for covenant agreement that he makes with Abraham and through Abraham with his sons Isaac and Jacob. And so we see this very clear pattern in the Old Testament. Now, the rest of the chapters in Genesis, chapters 34 to 52, in large respect, has to do with how God does at protecting this promise, how God does at preserving this seed, these descendants. Because what we find beginning in chapter 34, and this is the incident with Dinah and the men, and really what it is, it's a threat of assimilation of the Canaanites. The Canaanite men would like to, marry the daughters of Jacob, and so Dinah becomes the kind of the focal point of that. And we see there, beyond the story, that it gives evidence of the threat that is going to be continually there until the descendants of Jacob would become numerous enough to be able to withstand it, the threat of assimilation. And so we find a lot of things going on in here. It's all around that. We find the covenant being reaffirmed again in this context. God appeared to Jacob again, blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And this is where we get the name for the nation, although later on in the Old Testament, the nation will sometimes be called Jacob. So you've got Jacob, Israel interchanged because of this name change. I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac I give to you, and to your descendants after you I give this land. So you see how this is being repeated throughout Genesis. God gave promise to Abraham, gave land to Abraham. Now God has confirmed that land is given to to Isaac and to Jacob, and will be given to his descendants. And so we see this unconditional promise of land being given. We find Joseph being sold into slavery. The threat of sibling jealousy. The family is here, at the verge of being torn apart. And so we see all of these forces coming into play, both from outside and from inside, that would serve, if not dealt with, to destroy God's purpose, to put it to an end. But God said He'll do it. So we find that these types of things are being met. So even though Joseph is sold into slavery, we find that in Egypt, of course, through more unfortunate incidences, but later then he becomes like prime minister. And God is going to use that in order to protect the rest of the family when they come down. The Judah incident in chapter 28, the threat of sinking into Canaanite morality, you kind of see outside, inside, outside, inside. It's a common way that Satan works against God's people and against God's program. And the Joseph story really can be summarized as God's gracious provision of a safe haven for the growth of His people into a nation, which is Goshen in the land of Egypt. And so God takes the negative things, He takes the dangerous things, He takes the things that if just left undone, people left to themselves would destroy the seed. And He turns them and uses them for good. And so eventually He's going to remove the people from the land of Canaan down to Egypt, which we have seen in the walkthrough. They're going to be there how long? 400 years. And that's how long He told Abraham they were going to be there. And they're going to be segregated in Goshen. The Egyptians did not like sheep herders. They were very prejudiced people. And, there was nobody around to tell them you can't do that. They did what they wanted in their own country. And so He says, make sure you tell Pharaoh that we're, tenders of goats and herders of sheep and cattlemen and so forth. What He's going to do is He's going to say, okay, I don't want you mingling with my population. We don't like your kind. We're going to put you off here in this area. Now, Goshen was a very lovely place, and it was good land. That was Joseph's influence. But God was providentially bringing them to a place where they would not have to be under any kind of the same threat of assimilation into Egyptian culture, Egyptian religion. And so for the next 400 years, they're there growing numerically as a people, as pretty much a homogeneous people. That is, they're staying ethnically, religiously pure. So that when they come out of Egypt, they are the descendants of Abraham. And there were some Egyptians apparently that came along with them, but so few that it was really inconsequential. They were the descendants of Abraham. And so Genesis really is the background to how we get this people and what this people is created for. So remember, these are the people who were first reading this material. And God is giving information that is foundational for His program for all of the ages and for all peoples. But it is directly applicable for this nation who needs a sense of identity. Why are we here? Why are we leaving? Where are we going? What is this all about? Well, it's about a covenant that God made with Abraham. And so look at what He's done. Look at what He's done to preserve you. Look at what He has done to this point. And so this is all the background. This is the introduction to who these people are, what they will become. And so that really is the theological overview of Genesis with regard to what's going on. And all of the details of Genesis need to be interpreted in that context and related in that context. Any questions on that before we move out of Genesis? No? Okay. So that gives us the theology of the walkthrough, why these events transpired the way they did, and where it's all going. Now, normally in the Old Testament, when people are studying the Old Testament, they go from Genesis to the book of Exodus, and they're cruising along. Exodus is pretty good. And the little end of it's going to get a little tedious, where you start talking about the building of tabernacle. And then they cruise into Leviticus and then they put their Bibles down and go watch videos. Because Leviticus is just, imponderable. But we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're going to go to Job next. Job? Job doesn't come to way down in the Bible. It's with Psalms and Proverbs, and it's wisdom literature. But remember I said we want to try and look at the Bible chronologically. Take things as they came. Now, we don't know when Job as a book was finished and put into the Scriptures, the canon, the received Scriptures of the Hebrews. But I want to take it now because it most likely reflects what was going on at the time of Abraham. It's an individual in his relationship with God. It's not part of this national covenant, but it is important. And so it also gets you into some wisdom literature more early in the course. So I'm going to just briefly introduce wisdom literature at this point, look at Job. Some of you maybe feel like you're suffering like Job now with all the homework we give you and so forth. You aren't. But there are some rich lessons for us in this book. So let's look at that. Just a quick introduction to wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is a literary genre. You know what the word genre means? Be a synonym. Style, type, kind. Give me some genres of music. Rock, reggae, country, techno, classical, Christian, rap, bad. Well, that's not a genre. That's an evaluative category. All right, so you know what genre is. Different types of things. We've got different types of literature. You got fiction, you got mystery, you got poetry, you got narrative, you've epic, scientific, technical. So no, that's what genre means. And wisdom literature is a common genre of literature that is found in the ancient Near Eastern world, in which two things happened. One, instructions for successful living are given, or the perplexities of human existence are contemplated. And so the genre of wisdom literature really has two thrusts or two directions. One is where you are given very specific and information as to how to make life work as best as is possible as it depends upon me. And this is the kind of wisdom literature that we find in the book of Proverbs. But there is another whole area of wisdom literature, and that is trying to figure out why things go wrong when we don't sense they should. When bad things happen to good people. And so it's more contemplative. It's thinking about the perplexities of human existence. And the books of Job and Ecclesiastes are the two representatives as works as a whole of wisdom literature that evidence this second kind, and Job fits into that. I don't know why these lost all my... Oh well. There's the literary dynamic. First of all, content and form. You have that in your outline. Content, universal issues about living in general. That's the content. Universal issues about living in general. Write that up there in that left-hand box. It's not dealing with history. It's not dealing with covenant. It's not dealing with things like that. It's dealing with life as I encounter it on Monday morning and Thursday afternoon. It's the everyday experience of life. And so that's content, and that's what marks wisdom literature in terms of its literary dynamic. In form, it is proverbial and speculative. These are the two types of of wisdom literature regarding form. Proverbial, like Proverbs 10 to 31, where you have these little sayings, these little aphorisms, these little maxims. We have these, in our own traditions. So parts of Ecclesiastes, some of the Psalms actually have wisdom-type material. Psalm 34, at one point, it turns from a declarative praise psalm to a wisdom teaching. And it says, "Come and let me teach unto you the fear of the Lord. Who will love life and see good days, and let his mouth not be given to such and such." And it sounds like it could come out of Proverbs. And so we find that. And then speculative. And the speculative is dialogue like Job, or monologue like Ecclesiastes, or Job has extensive monologues as well, or the extended instruction of Proverbs 1 to 9. Now, we'll come back to this in the second semester, but just so you know where Job fits in wisdom literature. It fits in this speculative kind, in this examining the perplexities of life. And there are a number of works that we have discovered from the ancient world. The Babylonian Job, you may have read some of these. They aren't really like Job, but they are in the same realm. They do not proceed the same way, and they're not really dealing with the same thing, but they are speculating on the whole issue of suffering and suffering of people before a just and a good and a loving God, and so forth. And so Job fits into that, and fits into that whole literary movement that occurred, at least a couple of thousand. In fact, it probably goes back at least 3,000 years before Christ. In terms of what we can determine from ancient sources. Now, let's just look a little bit at Job in terms of overview. How many of you have run into something in life that you just do not understand, and it just seems really, really, really unfair? Can I see your hands? The rest of you are either sleeping. We all have. We all have. And no matter how well you've been raised, no matter how strong a faith you may have, no matter how well you have been taught, there are things that come along in life that we don't understand, and we really can't see how God could be responsible. God could be behind it. And yet, we know our Bibles tell us, and we've been told, God, is in control of all things, and God has you in His hand, and God cares for you, and God won't let anything into your life that isn't ultimately for your good, that isn't ultimately for His glory. But we just have to shake our heads and say, I don't see it. I don't see it. And at that point, one of two things happen circumstantially. Either things get better or things get worse. And when things get better, we say, okay, good. I knew that this couldn't continue. I knew life, had to get better because that's what God does, is He makes life better. What happens when it gets worse? What do? Well, even with Christians, one of two things happens. Either faith is strengthened, no matter how bad it gets, or people just give up on the faith. Well, if that's the way God is, if that's the way the world is, if that's the way it's going to be, what is the point of believing? Because after all, it's all about me. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's not all about me. It's all about God. But God, what about me? And that's Job in a very, very basic sense, but it's a lot more complex than that. But Job is a book about what a man's experience when life not only got worse, but not only went bad, but got worse and stayed bad beyond what most people could handle. And the whole book, in terms of what he goes through with his friends and so forth, is really designed for Job's benefit, though he does not know it. And the key verse is Job 35:5. Look to the heavens and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than you. This is from the speech of Elihu, the fourth friend, who does not occur until chapter 32. In my understanding of the book, he's the hero in terms of the players who come along that make a difference positively with respect to Job's faith. And the clouds and what Elihu says about the clouds really become the single most important interpretive key to the book. Now get that. The clouds and how Elihu handles the clouds become the single most important interpretive element in the book with regard to what God wanted Job to learn. Job knew a lot of things about God. Job had a developed view of God. He had a close relationship with God. But it was improved as a result of his experience. A theodicy is what Job is called. A theodicy is the dealing with the interaction of human suffering and divine justice. How do we account for human suffering in a world that is controlled by a just God? By a divine being who claims to have control, who claims to be one who is directing life to good ends? How do we account for human suffering? Not just human suffering of the wicked, we can account for that as God's judgment, but what about the good? What about the innocent? What about babies? What about children? What about those human beings who just live such a good life and are so useful? What about them? What about it when they suffer? And so a theodicy is a work which explores the relationship, tries to answer the questions that arise when we consider, bad things happening to good people in a world that is controlled by a good God, a powerful God. And so you will see this term theodicy. And Job is the theodicy of all theodicies, but interestingly enough, it isn't a theodicy, because it never answers that question. And in fact, it doesn't even fully explore that question. It explores more the experience of Job. We have the Sumerian Job. We have the Babylonian Job. And as I said, when we read those, they are exploring the same kind of thing, but they really are not Job's. The biblical work is far above in its content and its style and its literary design. It's far above anything we've discovered in the ancient world, though they belong to the same genre. Now, the author is unknown. We don't know who the author is. Was it Job? Likely. Not, later on, God would have given him this information that he did not have in the first two chapters. But the author is not stated. There's only assumptions that could be made, and there's all kinds of weird and wild and wonderful assumptions that are made. But it is one work. I don't think it's a patchwork of many authors. The date of writing, well, again, early. I don't know, maybe later. It has many of the affinities in terms of the style that you would find in the writings of Solomon. So some would say, well, maybe Solomon wrote it. Maybe it's a story that came down and he wrote it. But realize that there's editorial activity that can happen. There's the final form of even a biblical work that can display later grammatical, stylistic devices that nonetheless are original. There are other stories like this, and there are literary forms like this. So there is no absolute reason why this cannot be, in its basic form, in its fairly complete form, an account as it came from a very, very early time. We do not know a fraction of what there is to know about literature in the ancient world, even though we do know a lot. And so you will read some very critical and negative views with respect to authorship and date. But it could be early from the way it stands, and there's no reason not to take it as an original, true account of a man who experienced these things, and God giving us his story through whatever processes. The time, second millennium BC, around 2000 or so. There are various reasons for that. The patriarchs lived during this time, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We see similarities with them, between them, in terms of the situations and what were happening. Like, for instance, the father acting as a priest for his family, and so forth. Job's age is 140. How long did Abraham live? We just saw that a few minutes ago. Remember? 175. And so this would fit with a long life, but in the same range of lives that we find in this period in the Bible. Wealth is measured in cattle. These are just a few things that are used to kind of pinpoint the cultural background against which this book best fits. And so wealth measured in cattle is something that was true at this time. We find that not just in the Bible, but we find that in extra-biblical. As I said, he acted as a priest for his family. And there are a number of things like this that would support the fact that the cultural, historical, time, milieu, background would be that of the patriarchal age. And that's why I'm taking it now, because this man could have been a contemporary of Abraham. And we have just dealt with Abraham and the covenant God made with him. And so that's most conservative. Well, all would say that it's written against that, with that as the background framework. Whether or not it's written early or late is another issue. So he was a very prosperous man, but he was a man also of great character. And it talks about his devotion. It talks about him offering sacrifices for his family, recognizing the necessity for atoning sacrifices to belay God's wrath against sin. And so we see indicated there very clearly his character. In verses 6 to 22, we find the attack on Job's possessions. Satan and God have made what has been called a wager, though it really isn't a wager, but in some senses it is. There is something to be lost if Job curses God, if Job acts in a way that would be out of character. And so God removes his protection. From this and other verses, you could well assume that, Satan, if he were not hindered, would destroy the whole human race. I mean, then he could rule over the universe. And that was probably part of what was going on in the garden anyway, is a vie for dominion or vie for rulership. And so God does release Job into his power for a time. In chapter 2, we see the attack on Job's person. And again, it increases. And so, you think you have it bad. Whenever you think you have it bad, go read Job. When Dr. Van Dyne gives you another assignment, and you just don't think you should handle any more assignments, go read Job. Okay? And don't have it so bad. And then finally, in verses 11 to 13 in chapter 2, we find the arrival of Job's friends. The arrival of Job's friends. And basically, what we find then in the rest of the book is Job arguing himself to silence so that he can hear God speak. And it takes a long time to get there. But there's a reason for that. And I usually teach Job and Ecclesiastes every other year. I'm teaching it right now, so in 2 years you can take that class and we can explore it in more detail. But the book really does have a clear point design to it. The poetic body, basically Job disputing his way to silence. Job is in just a tremendous agony. He's in tremendous emotional pain to go along with his physical pain. He is in confusion. His friends come and sit with him in silence for 7 days. And then Job opens his mouth, curses the day of his conception, curses the day of his birth, wishes that he had never been born, even wishes that God would take him. He never contemplates suicide. It's never in there. But he does come to the point where he feels it would have been better never to have lived. So he disputes his way to silence, but to understanding and to a deeper faith. So Job talks and 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 talks. His three friends talk and talk and talk, and Job talks and talks and talks, and they argue in the debate, and they go nowhere. For 30 chapters, it goes nowhere. Except it went somewhere. Because at the end, Job has said a whole lot of things to his friends, a whole lot of things to himself, and a whole lot of things to God. But God uses it to bring Job to the point where he sees something different. He hears something different. And so in one way, this is, one sense, this is a way to overview the whole thing. That he disputes his way to silence and to understanding and to deeper faith.